New York City buzzed with its usual morning chaos as Ernest Castle, a 72-year-old man with sun-weathered skin and eyes full of wisdom, prepared to attend a legal event in downtown Manhattan. His hands, which once wielded weapons and then surgical instruments, now trembled slightly as he buttoned his shirt in front of the mirror. "Grandpa, are you ready?" Alex's voice echoed from the living room. Ernest smiled, adjusting his tie one last time. "Coming, son," he replied, his voice deep and warm like the embrace of a century-old oak. Alex, a 28-year-old lawyer, waited anxiously. To him, his grandfather was more than just a relative. He was a beacon of integrity in an increasingly turbulent world. "Are you sure you want to go? You know Judge Morrison will be there, and after what happened last time..." Ernest raised a hand, gently interrupting his grandson. "Alex, I've faced worse things than a bitter judge. I'm not going to hide as if I've done something wrong." As they drove to the event in Alex's car, the city paraded before their eyes. Ernest observed the changes, new buildings rising like giants of glass and steel, contrasting with the historic neighborhoods struggling to maintain their identity. "Remember when all this was fields?" Ernest commented, pointing to a luxury apartment complex. Alex smiled. "Grandpa, that was a long time ago." "Not so long," Ernest replied with a glint of nostalgia in his eyes. "Time passes quickly, son. That's why it's important to do the right thing while we can." Upon arriving at the event, an imposing Supreme Court building greeted them. Ernest straightened up, his presence commanding respect despite his age. Several young lawyers recognized him, greeting him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "Mr. Castle, what an honor to have you here," exclaimed a young lawyer, enthusiastically shaking his hand. Ernest smiled kindly, but his eyes scanned the room, searching for one particular face. And then he saw him, Judge Ignatius Morrison, a middle-aged man with a permanent look of disdain on his face. Their gazes crossed for an instant. Morrison frowned, whispering something to his assistant before turning away ostentatiously. "Grandpa," Alex murmured, noticing the tension, "maybe we should..." But Ernest was already heading towards the podium, where the conference on judicial ethics was about to begin. His step was firm, his gaze determined. He hadn't come to provoke, but to defend the principles that had guided his life. As he took a seat in the front row, Ernest couldn't help but remember his long career. From his days as a young cadet in the army, through his years as a doctor in conflict zones, to his career as a judge, each stage had shaped him, teaching him the value of justice and compassion. The conference began, and with it, the tension in the room grew. Ernest listened attentively, nodding occasionally. But when the moderator opened the floor for questions, the atmosphere changed. "I have a question for former Judge Castle," Morrison announced, his voice laden with malice. "How can someone who clearly benefited from affirmative action policies speak about ethics?" A sepulchral silence fell over the room. Ernest slowly stood up, his dignity intact in the face of the barely veiled insult. "Judge Morrison," he began, his voice firm but serene, "my career speaks for itself. Every position I've held, I've earned through effort and dedication. Ethics is not an abstract concept, but something demonstrated through daily actions." Morrison, visibly irritated by Ernest's measured response, abruptly stood up. "Nonsense. You and your kind always hide behind big words, but the reality is that..." "Order!" shouted the moderator, but it was too late. Morrison approached Ernest, his face contorted with anger. "It's about time someone took you down a peg, old man." What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds, but to Ernest, it seemed like an eternity. Morrison, blinded by his prejudice and frustration, pushed Ernest hard. The old man, taken by surprise, lost his balance and fell to the floor before the horrified gaze of those present. "Grandpa!" Alex shouted, running towards him. As he lay on the ground, Ernest felt no physical pain, but a deep sadness. Not for himself, but for a society that still allowed hatred and prejudice to have so much power. At that moment, as alarmed voices surrounded him and his grandson's hands helped him to his feet, Ernest Castle knew that his fight was not over. In fact, it had just begun. Chaos overtook the room in a matter of seconds. Alex, with a mixture of rage and concern, helped his grandfather to his feet, while shooting a withering look at Judge Morrison. "This won't stand," Alex exclaimed, his voice trembling with indignation. Ernest, still stunned by the fall, leaned on his grandson. His dignity, however, remained intact. "Easy, son," he murmured, his voice barely audible amid the uproar. Valerie Lopez, a renowned lawyer who had witnessed the entire incident, quickly approached. "Mr. Castle, are you all right?" "I witnessed what just happened, and this is unacceptable." Meanwhile, Judge Morrison, realizing the gravity of his actions, tried to slip away through the crowd. However, several attendees surrounded him, preventing his exit. "Let me through!" Morrison shouted, his arrogance quickly transforming into panic. "I'm a federal judge!" "And that makes you even more responsible for your actions," replied another lawyer present, blocking his path. The event moderator, visibly shaken, tried to restore order. "Please remain calm. We will call the appropriate authorities to handle this situation." Ernest, slowly regaining his composure, observed the scene with a mixture of sadness and determination. His eyes met Morrison's, who now showed an expression of poorly disguised fear. "Alex," Ernest said softly, "help me sit down. I need a moment." As Alex settled his grandfather into a chair, Valerie Lopez approached again. "Mr. Castle, I'm attorney Valerie Lopez. What just happened is a clear case of assault and discrimination. If you'll allow me, I'd like to offer you my legal assistance." Ernest looked at her, recognizing the name. Valerie Lopez was known for defending civil rights causes. "I appreciate your offer, counselor," he responded with a tired but firm voice. "But before making any decision, I need to reflect on what happened." Alex, however, was not willing to let the opportunity pass. "Grandpa, this can't be left like this. Judge Morrison must answer for his actions." At that moment, 2 police officers entered the room. The atmosphere tensed even more as they approached the group. "Who is Ernest Castle?" one of the officers asked. "That's me," Ernest responded, slowly standing up. "Sir, we need you to come with us to give a statement," the officer said. Then, turning to Morrison, he added, "You too, Judge." As they prepared to leave, Ernest couldn't help but notice the looks from those present, some of sympathy, others of curiosity, and a few, the ones that hurt him the most, of barely disguised prejudice. On the way to the police station, Ernest remained silent, lost in his thoughts. He remembered his long career, the battles he had fought, the obstacles he had overcome. Had it all been in vain? Had society not progressed in all these years? Upon arriving at the station, Ernest and Morrison were taken to separate rooms to give their statements. Alex insisted on accompanying his grandfather, while Valerie Lopez offered to be present as a witness and legal support. In the statement room, Ernest narrated the facts calmly and precisely, without omitting details or exaggerating what had occurred. His voice, though tired, did not lose the strength that had characterized him throughout his career. "And then Judge Morrison pushed me, causing me to fall," Ernest concluded. The officer, taking the statement, frowned. "Mr. Castle, are you sure you want to proceed with this accusation? Judge Morrison is a powerful figure and this could bring you problems." Before Ernest could respond, Alex intervened indignantly. "Are you suggesting that my grandfather lie or stay quiet in the face of an assault?" "Alex," Ernest said firmly, "let me speak." Turning to the officer, he continued, "Young man, I have faced much more difficult situations than this. I'm not seeking revenge, but justice. And justice must be equal for all, regardless of position or influence." Valerie, impressed by Ernest's integrity, added, "Officer, I witnessed everything that occurred, and I'm willing to testify. Judge Morrison not only physically assaulted Mr. Castle, but also uttered racist insults before the incident." Meanwhile, in another room, Morrison was giving his version of events, trying to minimize his actions and blame Ernest for provocation. However, his nervousness was evident, and his arguments sounded increasingly weak. Upon leaving the police station hours later, Ernest encountered a small group of journalists who had already been alerted to the incident. Cameras and microphones rushed towards him. "Mr. Castle, what can you tell us about Judge Morrison's aggression? Do you plan to take legal action? Do you think this incident reflects a broader problem in the judicial system?" Ernest raised a hand, asking for silence. With a clear and serene voice, he declared, "All I can say at this moment is that I trust justice will prevail. I'm not seeking revenge, but respect for the dignity of all people, regardless of their age, race, or social position. As they moved away from the police station, Alex could no longer contain his frustration. "Grandpa, how can you be so calm? That man assaulted you in front of everyone." Ernest stopped, looking at his grandson with a mixture of affection and determination. "Alex, anger and resentment only cloud judgment. Our fight must be with a cool head and a firm heart. This is not just my battle. It's an opportunity to expose and combat prejudices that still persist in our society." Valerie, who was accompanying them, nodded with admiration. "Mr. Castle is right. This case could set an important precedent. If you'll allow me, I'd like to represent you legally." Ernest looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set over New York City. He knew that the coming days would be difficult, that he would have to relive old wounds and face new challenges, but he also knew that this could be his last great battle, an opportunity to leave a legacy of justice and dignity. "All right," he finally said. "Let's accept Ms. Lopez's help. But remember, our fight is not against Morrison as an individual, but against the system that allows people like him to abuse their power." As they walked away, Ernest couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. At 72 years old, he was about to embark on one of the most important battles of his life. A battle that, he hoped, would change not only his destiny, but that of many others who, like him, had faced injustice and prejudice throughout their lives. The morning after the incident, Ernest woke up with an aching body, a physical reminder of the previous day's fall. However, what weighed on him most was the emotional burden. As he prepared a coffee in the kitchen of his modest apartment, the doorbell rang. "Grandpa, it's me, Alex." His grandson's voice was heard from the other side of the door. Ernest opened it, finding Alex's worried face and Valerie Lopez's serious expression. "Good morning," Ernest greeted, stepping aside to let them in. "I see we're starting early." Valerie nodded, her briefcase firmly grasped. "Mr. Castle, the situation has become complicated. Judge Morrison has counterattacked." Ernest raised an eyebrow, inviting them to sit in the small living room. "What do you mean, Valerie?" "He has filed a defamation lawsuit against you," the lawyer explained, pulling some documents from her briefcase. "He alleges that you provoked him and that your accusations are false, motivated by an attempt to discredit the judicial system." Alex, who had remained silent until then, exploded. "This is ridiculous. There were dozens of witnesses." Ernest remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on an old photograph on the wall, where he was seen in his military uniform. "The truth always comes to light," he murmured. "Grandpa," Alex said, his voice mixed with concern and determination, "we can't sit idly by. We have to counterattack." Valerie nodded. "I agree. Mr. Castle, we need to gather all possible information about your career and your life. Anything Morrison might use against you, we need to know it first." Ernest slowly got up, heading to an old trunk in the corner of the room. He opened it carefully, revealing a set of documents, medals, and photographs. "My life is here," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "From my days in the army to my last case as a judge. But there are things, Valerie, that aren't on paper. Things I've tried to forget." Alex approached his grandfather, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Grandpa, what are you talking about?" Ernest took an old photograph, showing it to both of them. In it, a young Ernest in military uniform stood next to other soldiers, all with serious expressions. "1971, Ernest began. "I was a captain then. We were sent on a mission in the mountains of West Virginia. It was supposed to be a routine operation against drug trafficking, but..." His voice broke for a moment. "Things got out of control. There were injured civilians, accusations of abuse. I managed to prevent a massacre, but the cost was high. I confronted my superiors, reported irregularities. It cost me promotions and almost cost me my career." Valerie listened attentively, taking notes. "Mr. Castle, was there any official investigation?" "There was," Ernest nodded. "But as often happens, many things were covered up. I was one of the few who spoke out. They called me a traitor, said I was tarnishing the army's honor." Alex, visibly moved, hugged his grandfather. "Why did you never tell me this?" "There are wounds, son, that one prefers not to reopen," Ernest responded with a sad smile. "But now I see that the past always catches up with us." Valerie, processing the information, intervened. "Mr. Castle, this could be crucial. It shows a pattern of integrity and courage in the face of injustice. But it could also be used against you if we don't handle it properly. Ernest nodded. I know. And there's more, Valerie. My career as a doctor, my decisions as a judge. I've made powerful enemies over the years. People who wouldn't hesitate to use anything to discredit me. Then we have to be prepared, Alex affirmed with determination. Grandpa, we need to know everything, every detail, every possible angle of attack. For the next few hours, Ernest shared stories from his life that he had kept silent for decades. He spoke of his days in the army, of the lives he saved as a doctor in conflict zones, and of the difficult cases he faced as a judge. Valerie listened and took notes, her mind working on legal strategies. Alex, for his part, saw his grandfather in a new light, understanding the depth of the struggles he had faced. Mr. Castle, Valerie finally said, your life is a testimony of courage and principles. But Morrison and his allies will try to distort every action, every decision. We must be prepared for a battle not just legal, but also in the media. Ernest stood up, looking out the window at the city he loved so much and for which he had fought so hard. Then so be it. I've spent my life defending what I believe is right. I'm not going to stop now. Alex, moved by his grandfather's determination, added, You're not alone in this, Grandpa. We'll fight together. Valerie nodded, closing her briefcase. I'll prepare our legal strategy. But Mr. Castle, Alex, you must be prepared. This will get ugly before it gets better. As Valerie and Alex prepared to leave, Ernest's phone rang. It was an unknown number. Ernest answered, listening in silence for a few moments before hanging up. Who was it? Alex asked, concerned. Ernest looked at his grandson and Valerie, his expression a mixture of surprise and caution. It was General Ramirez, my former superior in the army. He says he has information about Morrison, information that could change everything. Valerie and Alex exchanged glances. The battle had barely begun, and it was already shaping up to be one of epic proportions. Ernest, for his part, felt the weight of his past and the uncertainty of the future, but in his heart burned the flame of justice that had always guided him. The afternoon sun bathed New York City, and in Ernest Castle's small apartment, 3 generations prepared for a fight that promised to shake the very foundations of justice in the country. The following afternoon, Ernest found himself in Central Park, his favorite place to reflect. The bustle of children playing and families strolling contrasted with the storm of thoughts in his mind. General Ramirez's call had left him uneasy. Mr. Castle, a familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. It was General Ramirez, as imposing as he remembered, though time had silvered his hair and furrowed his face with wrinkles. General, Ernest greeted, standing up. Despite the years and past differences, the military respect remained intact. Ramirez sat down next to him, his gaze fixed on the lake. It's been a long time, Castle. I see you're still getting into trouble. 6 months had passed since the assassination attempt on Ernest Castle. New York City and the entire country had changed radically. The judicial system was in the midst of a profound reform, and the fight against corruption had become the government's #1 priority. Ernest, at 73 years old, was in his office at the new Center for Judicial Ethics, an institution created as a direct result of his struggle. Despite his family's insistence that he retire, he had remained firm in his commitment to see the process through to the end. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Alexander. "Grandpa," he said, entering with a smile, "it's time. Everyone is waiting for you." Ernest nodded, slowly rising. Today was an important day, the day when the new Judicial Code of Ethics would be presented to the public. As they walked through the building's corridors, Ernest couldn't help but reflect on the journey. Images flashed through his mind. Morris's assault, the chase in the museum, the nights of planning, the assassination attempt. Each moment had been a step towards this day. Upon reaching the auditorium, they were greeted by a standing ovation. The place was packed. Judges, lawyers, law students, journalists, and ordinary citizens who had closely followed Ernest's struggle. Valerie, now Director of Judicial Integrity, was the first to speak. "Today is a historic day for America," she began. "We are presenting a code of ethics that not only sets the highest standards for our judges, but also provides real accountability mechanisms." When it was Ernest's turn to speak, The silence in the room was palpable. He approached the podium with slow but sure steps, his presence as imposing as ever. "A year ago," he began, his voice strong and clear, "we were on the edge of an abyss. Corruption threatened to destroy the very foundations of our justice system. But today, we are here, united, proving that change is possible." He paused, looking at the attentive faces in the audience. "This code is not just a set of rules, it's a commitment, a promise we make to our country. A promise of integrity, transparency, and true justice." As Ernest continued his speech, the camera panned across the auditorium, showing emotional faces, some even with tears in their eyes. Among the audience, familiar faces could be seen. General Ramsey, now National Security Advisor; Charlie, Alexander's friend who had helped decipher the USB drive, now head of cybersecurity for the judicial branch; and Sarah Mitchell, the journalist who had published the original story, now a respected political analyst. "But our work doesn't end today," Ernest continued. "In fact, it's just beginning. This code is only the first step. It's up to each of us, every judge, every lawyer, every citizen, to keep the flame of justice alive." As he finished his speech, the applause was deafening. Ernest, visibly moved, was embraced by Alexander and Valerie. After the ceremony, as people dispersed, Ernest found himself surrounded by a group of young law students. "Mr. Castle," said a young woman, her eyes bright with admiration, "you've inspired us all. What advice would you give to those of us just starting our careers in law?" Ernest smiled, remembering his own days of youth. "Never forget why you chose this path," he replied. "The law is not just a set of rules, it's an instrument of justice and social change. Be brave, be honest, and never stop fighting for what's right, no matter how difficult it may seem." That night, in the tranquility of his apartment, Ernest reflected on everything that had happened. Alexander and Valerie were with him, sharing a quiet dinner. "Grandpa," said Alexander, raising his glass, "to you, to your bravery, to everything you've accomplished." Valerie nodded, adding, "Mr. Castle, you've changed the course of our country's history. Your legacy will live on for generations." Ernest, moved, looked at these young people who had been by his side every step of the way. "No, my dears," he said softly, "this achievement belongs to all of us. To every citizen who raised their voice, to every honest judge who stood firm, to every journalist who sought the truth, the real hero is America itself, which dared to believe in a better future." He slowly stood up and walked to the window, looking at the city he loved so much. The lights of New York City shone in the night, a testament to the life and hope that never went out. "Our work is not finished," he said, turning to Alexander and Valerie. "In fact, it's just beginning. But now I know with certainty that the future is in good hands." As the night progressed, Ernest Castle, the man who had shaken the foundations of the American judicial system, allowed himself to feel, for the first time in a long time, a deep sense of peace. He had fulfilled his mission. He had made the difference he had always dreamed of making. And so, in the heart of New York City, a new chapter in the history of justice began to be written. A chapter of hope, integrity, and real change. A legacy that Ernest Castle, and all those who fought by his side, would leave for future generations. As the weeks turned into months, Ernest Castle found himself at the center of a nationwide movement for judicial reform. The new Center for Judicial Ethics in New York became a beacon of hope, attracting visitors from across the country and even internationally. One crisp autumn morning, Ernest arrived at his office to find Alexander waiting for him, a stack of papers in hand. "Grandpa, you won't believe this," Alexander said, excitement evident in his voice. "We've received requests from 20 different states. They want to implement our ethics program in their judicial systems." Ernest smiled, a mixture of pride and determination in his eyes. "That's wonderful news, Alexander. But remember, implementation is always the hardest part. We need to ensure that these aren't just empty gestures." As they discussed the details, Valerie entered the office, her face grave. "Mr. Castle, Alexander, we have a situation. Judge Morris has been released on bail." The news hit them like a thunderbolt. Morris, the corrupt judge whose actions had initially sparked their crusade, was now back on the streets. "How is this possible?" Alexander demanded, his fists clenched in anger. Valerie shook her head, frustration evident in her voice. His lawyers found a technicality. They're arguing that some of the evidence against him was obtained illegally. Ernest leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This could be a setback, but it could also be an opportunity. The public needs to see that the old system is still fighting back. It might galvanize more support for our reforms. Over the next few days, the news of Morris's release dominated the headlines. Protests erupted across New York City, with people demanding justice and expressing their support for Ernest and his team. As the situation unfolded, Ernest received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Mitchell, the journalist who had first broken the story of judicial corruption, arrived at his office unannounced. "Mr. Castle," she said, her voice urgent, "I have information you need to hear. It's about Judge Morris and his connections. They go deeper than we ever imagined." For the next hour, Sarah laid out a complex web of corruption that extended far beyond the judiciary. Politicians, business tycoons, even some law enforcement officials were implicated. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering. "This is bigger than we thought," Ernest murmured, his mind reeling from the implications. "We're not just fighting corrupt individuals. We're up against an entire system." As they strategized their next move, Alexander burst into the office. "Grandpa, you need to see this." He turned on the television where breaking news was unfolding. On the screen, they saw Judge Morris holding an impromptu press conference outside the courthouse. His words sent a chill down their spines. "I am the victim of a witch hunt," Morris declared, his voice filled with righteous indignation. "Ernest Castle and his so-called ethics crusade are nothing but a front for a political takeover of our judicial system. I have evidence that will expose their true agenda." Ernest watched the screen, his face a mask of calm determination. "So this is how they want to play it. Very well, we'll meet them head-on." Over the next few weeks, the battle lines were drawn. Morris and his allies launched a full-scale media assault, attempting to discredit Ernest and the ethics reform movement. They painted Ernest as a power-hungry old man, desperate for one last shot at fame. But Ernest and his team were prepared. They had anticipated this move and had their own strategy ready. "We fight lies with truth," Ernest told his team during a late-night strategy session. "Every accusation they make, we counter with facts. Every smear campaign, we respond with transparency. Let the public see who's really fighting for justice." The Center for Judicial Ethics became a hive of activity. Volunteers poured in, offering their time and skills to help with research, public outreach, and legal support. Law students, retired judges, and concerned citizens all rallied around Ernest's cause. Meanwhile, Alexander took charge of their digital strategy. He worked tirelessly to combat misinformation online, creating engaging content that explained complex legal concepts in simple terms. His efforts paid off as their social media following grew exponentially. Valerie, leveraging her extensive legal network, organized a series of public forums across the country. These events allowed people to voice their concerns about the justice system and learn about the proposed reforms. The turnout was overwhelming, with venues often packed to capacity. As the public debate raged on, Ernest found himself reflecting on the long journey that had brought him to this point. One evening, as he sat in his study, he pulled out an old photo album. Inside were pictures from his early days as a young lawyer, full of idealism and hope. Alexander found him there, lost in thought. "Grandpa? Are you okay?" Ernest looked up, a wistful smile on his face. "Just remembering, mijo. You know, when I started out, I thought changing the world would be easier. I was so naive." Alexander sat down beside him, looking at the old photos. "But you did change the world, Grandpa. Look at everything you've accomplished." Ernest shook his head. "We've made a start, but the real work is still ahead of us. This fight with Morris and his cronies, it's just the beginning." As they talked, the phone rang. It was Valerie, her voice urgent. "Mr. Castle, you need to turn on the news right now." They rushed to the television where a breaking news banner flashed across the screen. The headline made their hearts skip a beat. "Anonymous whistleblower exposes massive judicial corruption ring." The report detailed a trove of documents that had been leaked to multiple news outlets simultaneously. These documents provided irrefutable evidence of the corruption network that Sarah Mitchell had uncovered. implicating dozens of high-ranking officials. "This changes everything," Alexander breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ernest nodded, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "Indeed it does. The real battle starts now." Over the next few days, the nation was gripped by the unfolding scandal. The evidence was damning, leaving no doubt about the extent of corruption within the system. Judge Morris and his allies found themselves on the defensive, their carefully crafted narratives crumbling in the face of hard facts. As the public outrage grew, calls for action became impossible to ignore. Politicians who had been hesitant to support judicial reform now clamored to associate themselves with the movement. The tide was turning. Ernest and his team worked around the clock, coordinating with law enforcement agencies, providing expert testimony to congressional committees, and continuing their public education efforts. The Center for Judicial Ethics became the nerve center of a nationwide push for sweeping reforms. Months passed, filled with intense debates, legal battles, and public demonstrations. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of struggle, a landmark bill was introduced in Congress. The Comprehensive Judicial Reform Act promised to implement many of the changes Ernest and his team had been fighting for. The day of the vote arrived. Ernest, along with Alexander, Valerie, and a crowd of supporters, gathered in the gallery of the House of Representatives. The tension in the air was palpable as the votes were cast. As the final tally was announced, the gallery erupted in cheers. The bill had passed with an overwhelming majority. Tears of joy and relief flowed freely as Ernest embraced his grandson and colleagues. Their hard work had finally paid off. But even in this moment of triumph, Ernest knew that their work was far from over. Implementing the reforms would be a long and challenging process. There would be resistance, setbacks, and new obstacles to overcome. As they left the Capitol building, surrounded by jubilant supporters and flashing cameras, Alexander turned to his grandfather. "What now, Grandpa?" Ernest looked out at the crowd, his eyes shining with determination. "Now we make sure these changes stick. We keep fighting, keep pushing forward. The journey to true justice is a long one, but we've taken a giant step today." In the months and years that followed, Ernest Castle continued to be a driving force in the implementation of judicial reforms. The Center for Judicial Ethics expanded its operations, opening branches in cities across the country. They developed training programs for judges and lawyers, created public education initiatives, and established watchdog groups to monitor the judiciary. Judge Morris and many of his co-conspirators faced trial, their cases becoming high-profile examples of the new era of accountability. The proceedings were televised, allowing the public to see justice in action. Ernest, despite his advancing age, remained actively involved in the movement he had started. He became a sought-after speaker, inspiring new generations of lawyers and activists with his unwavering commitment to justice. 5 years after the passage of the Comprehensive Judicial Reform Act, Ernest stood on a stage at Harvard Law School, preparing to deliver a commencement address to a new class of graduates. As he looked out at the sea of eager young faces, he felt a sense of hope for the future. "When I began this journey," he started, his voice strong despite his years, "I was told that the system was too entrenched, too powerful to change. But you, the next generation of legal minds, have proven that change is not only possible, but inevitable when people stand together for what is right." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "The work we've done, the changes we've made, they're just the beginning. The pursuit of justice is a never-ending task. It requires vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. As you leave here today, I challenge you to take up this mantle, be the guardians of justice our society needs." As Ernest concluded his speech to thunderous applause, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The world he was leaving behind was not perfect, but it was better. The seeds of change had been planted, and he had faith that these young minds would nurture them into full bloom. Later that evening, as Ernest sat in his hotel room reflecting on the day, there was a knock at the door. It was Alexander, who had flown in to surprise him. "Grandpa," Alexander said, embracing the old man, "that was an incredible speech. You should have seen the impact you had on those students." Ernest smiled, patting his grandson's back. "It's their turn now, Alexander. We've laid the groundwork, but it's up to them to build upon it." As they sat together discussing the future and reminiscing about the past, Ernest felt a deep sense of contentment. He had fought the good fight, had made a real difference in the world, and now seeing the passion and determination in his grandson's eyes and in the eyes of those young graduates, he knew that the struggle for justice would continue long after he was gone. The story of Ernest Castle and his fight for judicial reform would be told for generations to come, inspiring countless others to stand up for what is right, no matter the odds. It was a testament to the power of one individual's unwavering commitment to justice and the ripple effect it could have on an entire nation. As the night deepened and the city lights twinkled outside their window, Ernest and Alexander continued their conversation, planning for the challenges that lay ahead. The journey was far from over, but with each passing day, the dream of a truly just and equitable legal system came ever closer to reality. In the years that followed, Ernest's legacy continued to grow. The reforms he had championed began to show tangible results across the country. Corruption within the judiciary decreased significantly, public trust in the legal system improved, and a new culture of accountability took root. However, as with any significant change, there were still challenges to overcome. Some resistant to change tried to find loopholes in the new systems, while others attempted to undermine the reforms through political maneuvering. But the movement Ernest had started had gained too much momentum to be easily derailed. Alexander, following in his grandfather's footsteps, became a prominent figure in the ongoing fight for judicial integrity. He took on leadership roles in various legal advocacy groups and worked tirelessly to ensure that the spirit of the reforms remained strong. Valerie, with her extensive legal expertise, became a key advisor to several state governments as they implemented their own versions of the judicial ethics program. Her work helped to create a more standardized approach to judicial accountability across the nation. As for Ernest, even in his late 70s, he remained an active voice in the national conversation about justice and ethics. He wrote books, gave interviews, and continued to mentor young lawyers and activists. His apartment became a frequent gathering place for strategy sessions and discussions about the future of the legal system. One day, as Ernest was preparing for a video interview with a major news network, he received an unexpected call. It was from a former clerk of Judge Morris, someone who had been silent throughout the entire ordeal. "Mr. Castle," the voice on the other end said, trembling slightly, I need to confess something. I knew about Judge Morris's corrupt activities for years, but I was too afraid to speak up. Your courage, your persistence, it's given me the strength to finally come forward. I have information that could help with some of the ongoing investigations. This call was just one of many such moments that continued to unfold years after the initial exposé. People who had been silent out of fear or complicity found the courage to speak up, further unraveling the complex web of corruption that had plagued the system for so long. As Ernest hung up the phone, he felt a mixture of emotions: sadness for the years of silence, hope for the continued progress, and a renewed determination to keep pushing forward. The interview that followed was one of Ernest's most powerful yet. He spoke not just about the successes of the reform movement, but also about the ongoing challenges and the need for eternal vigilance. Justice is not a destination, he told the millions watching at home. It's a journey. Each generation must recommit to this journey, must fight to preserve and expand the principles of fairness and equality under the law. We've made great strides, but there is still much work to be done. As the years passed, Ernest's physical strength began to wane, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. On his 80th birthday, a grand celebration was held in his honor. Judges, lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens from across the country gathered to pay tribute to the man who had changed the face of American justice. During the celebration, a surprise announcement was made. The American Bar Association, in recognition of Ernest's lifelong commitment to judicial ethics, had created the Ernest Castle Award for Judicial Integrity. This annual award would be presented to a judge who demonstrated exceptional ethical conduct and commitment to justice. As Ernest stood to accept this honor, the room erupted in a standing ovation. Tears in his eyes, he looked out at the crowd, seeing faces young and old, all united in their commitment to the cause he had championed for so long. "This award," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is not for me. It is for every brave soul who stood up against corruption, who refused to be silenced, who believed that our system could be better. It is for the future generations who will continue this fight long after we are gone." In the aftermath of the celebration, as Ernest sat in his study reflecting on his life's work, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had been given the opportunity to make a real difference in the world, to leave it better than he found it. But even as he basked in the glow of recognition, Ernest knew that the work was far from over. New challenges were emerging: the impact of technology on the legal system, the ongoing struggle for equal access to justice, the need to address systemic biases. These would be the battles for the next generation to fight, and fight they would. Ernest saw in Alexander, in the young lawyers he mentored, in the passionate activists he met, the same fire that had driven him all those years ago. The torch was being passed, and he had every confidence that it was in good hands. As he looked out his window at the city he loved, the city that had been the stage for so much of his life's drama, Ernest Castle smiled. The path of justice was long and winding, with many obstacles along the way. But as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, to fight for fairness and integrity, there was hope. The story of judicial reform in America was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But thanks to the courage and determination of Ernest Castle, and countless others like him, the foundations had been laid for a more just and equitable future. As the sun set on another day, Ernest picked up his pen and began to write. There were still stories to tell, lessons to share, and inspiration to provide. The journey continued, and Ernest Castle, even in his twilight years, remained committed to lighting the way forward.